Hey, thanks for tuning in. In this video, we're going to talk about the issue of temptation. Is it an external struggle or an internal struggle? When I was raised in Christian teachings and I was around a lot of different Christian people, the topic of temptation would come up at times. And of course, depending upon the person, depending upon their beliefs, sometimes it would be very much focused on. It would be treated as this continual struggle with the forces of evil, with demons, etc., that were just continually bombarding people with temptation. And in some people's experience, this was just a constant battle for them with external forces in order to seek to do right, that they were continually being compelled to do wrong against their own will. Well, this is kind of interesting, of course, but in my view, I think what is really going on is a lot of times it amounts to internal desires that are not completely in line with one another. And I'll give a few examples of this. First off, not everyone experiences temptation in the same way and for the same things. And you can probably think of some things in your own life that you would never even consider doing, that you've never felt temptation for, even though they are not allowed by the commands. And one prime example of this, probably in my opinion, and of course this is probably kind of unpleasant to talk about, but that's the reason I bring it up, is the issue of bestiality. I don't think that very many people experience temptation to do that. I don't think very many people feel like they are just continually being compelled to do that. I'm pretty sure for most people that is considered just, something that would never even be considered. And so why is it that people are not being tempted to do it? And I'm sure someone out there probably has, but for the most part, it's still wrongdoing, it's still sin. It's still a violation of the commands. So why is it that people are not experiencing temptation for it? And of course, I think in part, that's because of internal desires. If someone has no interest in that sort of thing, then where is temptation? Where does that play in? It doesn't. And there are a few other examples of this. A few other examples of related situations. One is, I met someone that I think he used to be involved in the LDS church. And of course, they believe that alcohol is not supposed to be consumed, from my understanding. But he very much did like to drink, and he made that evident, but he was telling us and trying to persuade us that it was actually a sin to drink alcohol. And of course, generally speaking, this is not something that's prohibited in the commands. But he very much was convinced that it should be, or that it was. But apparently he was incurring temptation to do it regardless, and he felt compelled to do it despite the fact that he thought it was wrong. So in this situation, we're talking about something that's not actually sin, but the person believes it's sin, and they believe, presumably, that they are encountering temptation as a result. They are feeling compelled by external forces to do this thing that they consider sin. There are plenty of things out there that are not allowed to be done by the commands, that actually are violations of the commands. And so what reason would these external forces be compelling people to do stuff that isn't a violation when they could be picking from any number of other things to compel them to do that is actually sin, that is actually a violation of the commands? It beats me. I think it's probably because of internal desires. And the third point I want to talk about is that there are things that people consider not an issue of sin. So they don't consider doing it or not doing it as sin or not sin. It's completely separate from that. And that is objectively the case as well, that it's not prohibited in the law, it's not commanded in the law, and so it isn't an issue of sin. And yet people still experience temptation. Dieting and exercise are two very obvious examples in our American culture. So a lot of people will decide, at least part of them decides, they think they want to get in shape, or they think they want to eat more reasonably. And of course, while there are some issues that could relate to the commands, let's just isolate it to issues of eating reasonable amounts, for example. So a person might decide they want to eat reasonable amounts, but then in the situation, they may feel strongly compelled to do otherwise. They may have desires that come into play that weren't there before, and desires that come into play in the moment, and then they feel like they need to do something they didn't want to do. And so there's an internal struggle, whether it be to eat certain foods that they wanted to keep off limits, or to overeat, eat too much, any number of things, or to not get up and go exercise, not get up early and go exercise, or take the time to do it, etc. None of these issues are issues of right or wrong. They may be issues of wisdom and maybe issues of health, but they're not issues of sin. And yet people will describe the experience almost identically to the issue of experiencing temptation to sin. And they'll even call it temptation, and people will even project that onto the foods that they want to eat but are struggling against eating. So there may be some kind of special pleasure junk food that they like, that they want to cut from their diet, and they feel tempted by that food. They feel tempted by that cake or some other thing. And obviously, the cake is not some external force that is compelling someone to eat it, but that's how they're experiencing it. And once again, in my view, this is an issue of having mixed desires. They're having internal desires to do two things at once that cannot fit together. So they want to eat reasonably, but they want to eat the cake, or they want to overeat, or they don't want to exercise, etc. And so they're experiencing a desire to do one thing and a desire to do something else, and those two cannot fit together. And so there's an internal struggle. There's this temptation. There's this compulsion. And instead of just being resolved about what they're doing, they allow this to go on because they have divided desires on the issue. And I think that this is the same experience in a lot of cases, and at least in part, with the issue of being tempted to sin. And personally, I know that my experience of that changed drastically whenever I realized that I actually needed to follow the commands, that I actually wanted to be following the commandments of God. My experience of all of this changed drastically. And so no longer was I feeling like compelled to do things that I thought were wrong. I didn't feel that way hardly at all after I realized I wanted to keep the commands. And a lot of people probably cannot relate to this if they have not had that personal experience. A lot of people seem to project and think that that's totally unreasonable. How can you describe such a thing? That's, totally unrealistic. But that is my personal experience of it. And that's not to say that I don't still have some divided desires that come up. That is certainly the case. But I think we need to recognize them for what they are. That's not to say that there are not forces of evil or they're not outside influences, but we need to take responsibility for the fact that we are not always desiring the right thing. There are divided desires that we may have, and we need to recognize that, and we need to recognize where they're coming from. While we may have learned them from outside sources or may have been influenced at one time, a lot of times it is just what we personally are wanting. So I think we should recognize that temptation oftentimes is an internal struggle, and we should recognize that we have desires, and sometimes these desires are divided. Sometimes we have desires to follow after God, and there are other desires that we may also have had that come in and try to interfere with that. But that is an internal struggle. It is something that involves our desires. Thanks for watching. Feel free to check out some of my other videos where we talk about more issues of commands, and make sure that you stay in touch so we can continue this discussion. Thanks for watching. Remember the commands. Peace.